society organizations working across sectors and the full range of the SDGs were engaged in analyzing progress that has been made in terms of implementing SDG 13 in Trinidad and Tobago. Priority actions and recommendations for improvement were identified, and this was done under 5 thematic SDG clusters: gender inequality, sustainable cities and communities, energy and responsible consumption and production, biodiversity, health, water, and food security. And under each of these clusters, there are a number of relevant SDGs that we address. In the midst of COVID-19, this report, we think, takes on a greater importance to contribute to a push to put climate responses at the heart of recovery, so that there's a clean, green, and just recovery and the approach to building resilience in Trinidad and Tobago. In terms of our hope for the report, overall, we felt that the process for development of this report has caused us to think more deeply about how this can be a model for more meaningful civil society engagement and development in Caribbean countries. We hope that the report will meet its intention and support knowledge sharing and advocacy on civil society priorities, and by doing so help to increase recognition of civil society as a key development partner. We definitely look forward to more meaningful engagement of civil society in decision making and action on climate change in Trinidad and Tobago. Ultimately, we hope that the report will raise a question and engender increased consideration for how civil society can be a strong partner to government for a whole of society approach to climate action. Thank you very much. And with that, I think you've heard quite a bit from CANARI. So I would like to invite you now to hear from others joining us. And let me... And I would like to introduce you now and welcome the representative from the UN Resident Coordinator's Office in Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Mark Thomas, who will have to give a bit more context on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the VNR. And Mark has actually been part of our project steering committee for the CSOs for Good Governance project and has been quite supportive of this initiative. So let me hand you over now to Mark.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, let me apologize because I'm not the one that should really be doing this. The head of UNDP, Miss Randy Davis, the resident representative for UNDP, is out of the country. She's stuck abroad with the border being closed. And Rosemary Lal, who is the officer that oversees climate projects, is on sick leave. So you're stuck with me for the morning, I'm afraid. All right. So first of all, I would like to thank and congratulate CANARI on, are you all hearing me? I don't see the yellow block around me.
Yes, we're hearing you fine, Mark.
Okay, great. All right. So yes, first of all, yes, I'd like to thank and congratulate CANARI on this initiative. Of course, there is an official VNR that's being done by a consultant with the government, and that consultant was paid for by the UN, UNECLAC. But it's interesting as well to have a separate, more, well, not independent, but a separate report from the perspective of civil society, because of course civil society represents the civilians of the population, and it's nice to know that it's not merely the government saying that they're achieving these particular targets, but that the population as a whole is satisfied with the progress that's being made. And that's an important part of the process, and we congratulate CANARI and their partners and the EU for funding this initiative. With regards to what the UN has been doing on climate change, I think that's what I've been asked to present here a little bit this morning. The UN has been supporting the country in meeting its nationally designated contributions, which it committed to with the Paris Agreement in 2016. And it's working primarily with the government, with the Ministry of Planning and Development, and most directly with the Environmental Policy and Planning Division. Just in case anybody doesn't know what the targets are, we are supposed to try to reduce our emissions from industry, from transportation and power generation by 15% by 2030. And we are trying as well to cut our emissions from transportation by 30%. The UNDP has been supporting this work mainly through five ways. One project is called the Low Emission Capacity Building Program. I'll come to that in a little bit. The second one is the NDC support program. We're also doing a climate action transparency project, and we're assisting the country with its biannual update reports that the country is supposed to report every 2 years on its progress. Also, so those are the 4 avenues. The 5th avenue would be via JEF, Small Grants Project, where there is some funding available for small projects, mainly to install renewable energy generation in vulnerable communities. And thus far, I understand there have been solar panels being installed at community centers and health centers and such in rural communities. With regards, I suppose the prime program that the UNDP is supporting is the low emission capacity building. So the UN is supporting capacity building for the country to implement climate resilience actions and to build capacity to undertake those actions. We have supported the development of the nationally determined contributions roadmap and implementation plan. We also have been involved in the development of the National Measurement, Reporting and Verification System. So to measure progress, report on that progress, and to verify that what is being reported as actual progress is verified information. And we've been working with the government on 4 mitigation actions, again, in those high emission sectors: transportation, power generation, and industry. But most of our work has been in supporting policy and regulation with regards to climate change. And I should also add that the UN also supports biodiversity actions related to climate change, but that occurs through the FAO and not through the UNDP, and I'm not exactly qualified to speak on that. So that's about it for me. So the UN again remains committed to supporting this endeavor. We are very pleased with how it has turned out. We have been pleased with the progress with the actual voluntary national report. I understand it's in the final stages and is expected, well, I actually have to leave this meeting at 11 o'clock because we're visiting potential places where the report can be presented by the government. So again, I want to thank CANARI for undertaking this initiative, thank the EU for supporting this initiative, all the civil society organizations that have participated and that continue to play a role in this initiative, and we look forward to seeing what the report delivers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. We very much appreciate comments from the UN Resident Coordinator's Office and getting information on what is being done by the UNDP to support climate action and the SDGs. So thank you. And now what I would like to do is move to our feature session, which is the overview of the report itself, which I will share.
Candice, while you are getting that ready, this is Nicole. I just want to remind people that we will have a Q&A session. So if during your presentation, people have comments or questions, they can use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and write it down even as you're presenting, so we can come back and discuss afterwards. Thank you.
Yes, great. Thank you, Nicole. Okay, so just to start off the presentation, and this was mentioned in the opening remarks, the purpose of the report that we developed is to support knowledge sharing and advocacy on civil society priorities and recommendations for Trinidad and Tobago's implementation of SDG 13 climate action. In particular, we wanted to be able to share specific civil society perspectives on implementation of SDG 13, highlight civil society's role and contributions to SDG 13 implementation. And you would see in the report there are many examples of how civil society has actually been taking actions in various thematic areas. And of course, I think what the highlight is the scorecard, where we identify priorities and recommendations from civil society to accelerate action on SDG 13. What I wanted to emphasize here as we get into the report and the presentation of what the report has shown us is that we identify the voluntary national review as an opportunity for civil society participation in governance and development, and we recognize that there is a need for a more inclusive process where we engage civil society, including in their various roles as implementers, advocates, and watchdogs, to implement international commitments and national obligations that we have for sustainable development. And so we are saying that civil society has a role to play and that government cannot and should not do it alone. We are ready to partner and work with government as key development partners. In developing this report, we really wanted to take a cross-cutting approach to analyzing climate change across the SDGs, across sectors, which is really reflective of what the SDGs are already about. And so we took the approach of creating SDG clusters, where these function as thematic areas where we'll be able to analyze various sectors and how they each are impacted by climate change, what are the various priorities and actions that should be taken or that we would like as civil society to be taken, and what are learning and recommendations. And so we've looked at 5 thematic areas in terms of developing this report. And I have them laid out here, for example, climate change and biodiversity, where you see it is addressing multiple SDG areas, such as life, blue, water, SDG 14, and life on land, SDG 15. And this is the case for the other thematic areas as well, where we have tried to look at the various SDGs and sectors to get a comprehensive sense and do an integrated sort of cross-sectoral analysis of climate change and what actions have been taken and what priorities and recommendations we would like to put forward. So in developing the report, what are the key questions that we really asked ourselves? What were we trying to find out about and really put forward in this report? Well, we wanted to identify what firstly were priorities and targets for SDG 13 defined in our existing national and sectoral policies and plans for Trinidad and Tobago. And in the report, under each thematic area, we do a sort of analysis of what policies and plans are there and whether climate change, their policy objectives or measures that are included or priorities that are included. And of course, we looked at or started to talk through what are civil society's priorities for SDG 13 and how can these be addressed in Trinidad and Tobago. Beyond the priorities, we wanted to actually look at what actions are being implemented to address climate change, including by government, by civil society, and private sector stakeholders. And we have a couple tables within the report where you can see that we have listed where we were able to get and find information, what are the various initiatives and actions being taken by these various sectors, including what are achievements and progress that have been made in addressing priorities. And of course, in thinking about achievements and progress, we also highlighted or were able to pull out key gaps and challenges for implementation of SDG 13 in the various thematic areas. So what still needs to be done in terms of climate change and gender? What still needs to be done in terms of climate change and sustainable cities and communities or biodiversity? And thinking through the entire process in an integrated manner, we wanted to pull out also what are lessons and best practices that could help inform or improve actions being taken forward. We used a couple of different methods in terms of getting and mobilizing civil society organizations, engaging them in terms of preparing this report and giving inputs to the report. And one of our first steps was to hold a consultation workshop where actually initial priorities in each thematic area were drafted. And of course, then we followed this up because we wanted to get a sense from wider civil society and engage wider civil society in Trinidad and Tobago to get their inputs on priorities and recommendations for climate action. And so we developed an online survey, we conducted interviews, and whatever information we were able to gather, we conducted research and desk reviews to help validate and to fill any gaps. And this took place over a period December 2019 till about March 2020. So we spent a couple of months engaging CSOs as part of this process, and I'm happy to share that 53 civil society organizations, including members of the SDGs Catalysts Network and members of their networks, as well as additional civil society organizations in Trinidad and Tobago, were engaged and participated and provided inputs to this report. So at the end of our process, we came up with 30 civil society priorities for action on climate change in Trinidad and Tobago. And what I would do now is give you a sense in the various thematic areas, as well as cross-cutting priorities that were identified, what were those priorities exactly? And just to highlight here that when we developed, came up with the priorities from the thematic areas, we decided to use what we are calling the stoplight approach to actually assess and rank the priorities in terms of the progress we think has been made in achieving these particular priorities or actions. And so there are 5 cross-cutting priorities that were identified, and you can see the priority areas. There are several of them that we have ranked as having intermediate progress as well as little progress. And this is in terms of cross-cutting action on climate change. And I think overall, CSOs felt that there's been intermediate progress in meeting national commitments and priorities identified here for overarching and integrated action on climate change in Trinidad and Tobago. We recognize that linkages were being made across sectors to address climate change, but sometimes efforts were ad hoc or partnerships being formed not effectively leveraged. So for example, we have the Multilateral Environmental Agreement Focal Point Network, which we think is a great initiative, established and convened by the MEA units. However, it does require improvements in terms of the engagement strategy with civil society and other stakeholder groups. One of the key things we wanted to highlight is the need for increasing transparency, reporting and accountability on actions being taken by government and other actors at the national level. And we think that creating an enabling environment, for example, by the signing and ratifying of the SDG agreement is one way in which this could be addressed. And you'll see later on, this is a recommendation that has been put forward. So to highlight as well, one of the areas where we had a red stoplight, ensuring efforts to address climate change and other development issues are focused on poorest and most vulnerable. We think that definitely there needs to be more action in this area. And that current efforts to address climate change are focused on climate change mitigation. We see quite a lot of that in terms of addressing the greenhouse gases and so on. And addressing capacity of institutions to respond, but not so much effort in terms of building local adaptive capacity of the poorest and the most vulnerable, or engaging them in decision making and implementing concrete actions. So these are some of the key cross-cutting priorities that came out as part of the analysis. In terms of climate change, gender, and equality, overall, the assessments by civil society organizations participating suggest that additional work needs to be done to address climate change and gender in an integrated manner. So there's a need for capacity building. Some actions have been taken. We recognize that there are now gender focal points that have been appointed in the ministries, and we think it's an opportunity to use those gender focal points for climate change mainstreaming and getting information and action on climate change happening. But we think there needs to be an emphasis on gender sensitive assessments and data collection to support decision making. So in vulnerability assessments to climate change that are being done, are we collecting gender sensitive data that would allow us to make decisions that inform the types of actions that are needed? And of course, we think that participatory approaches to engaging stakeholders, especially the most vulnerable, needs to be improved. So there, in the report, again, just to highlight, under each of the thematic areas, we do share examples of actions that have been taken by government in the various areas, as well as actions by civil society organizations, and how it is helping to contribute to climate action. And one example here to highlight in terms of civil society action is that we know that the Kwanzaa Man's Community Restoration Project, for example, has partnered with gender experts at UE to really start to explore, build awareness, and promote dialogue on the intersectionality between climate change and gender, and specifically how gender influences one's ability to adapt to and mitigate effects of climate change. And so that is something that we definitely need to have more conversation on and need to promote. In terms of climate change, sustainable cities and communities, we found there are a couple of areas where definitely there's need for improvement, integrating climate change into the agenda of local government, where we feel that local government being more closely connected to communities could have greater impact in terms of getting communities on board and engaged in climate action. And spreading the actions that are closer to the ground where people tend to feel the impacts. We also recognize that there is need for consistent and concerted efforts then in ensuring community voices are institutionalized in decision making. Is there a mechanism for community voices to be included? And so, part of the discussion was, for example, do we look at the village councils for doing this, or what other opportunities are there for this? Another key area is looking at promoting entrepreneurial opportunities for sustainable and integrated waste management. And we definitely think that, you know, there is an overall need for focus on this, this particular area. While we have been making progress in other areas, for example, there are best practices and models for sustainable cities and communities, where we know the Green Building Council, for example, has piloted the first green building. There's been interest from government in having green spaces. I think the borough for Rima was in the news recently is saying, you know, we would like to make the borough a green space in Trinidad and Tobago. We definitely think overall that there remains a need for improved town and country planning and expanding options for addressing waste management issues to contribute to overall resilience. In terms of climate change, energy, and responsible consumption and production, generally we found that the link between climate energy and climate change and clean energy is, you know, well recognized and is well aligned with Vision 2030, which recognizes the need for alternative and clean energy and improved energy efficiency and so on in key sectors. However, we think one of the big areas is really the need to transform financing, including access and diversification to support climate action and green business. And what do we mean by that? Really, we think, you know, the Green Fund, which has been set up to support environmental projects in Trinidad and Tobago, we think there's a definite need for reformation of the Green Fund, which is currently limited in its functioning. You know, the application process is difficult, and so there's limited access to funds as well as long approval times. And so a recommendation that had come out of this is to improve functionality and efficiency of the Green Fund, including access to civil society organizations by simplifying the application process, you know, considering a tiered or comparative rate structure for different types of applicants, increasing transparency and the operation of the fund, and even reviewing the time for proposal review and response times. Some very practical measures to really start ensuring that there's access to funding for climate action in Trinidad and Tobago and to supporting green business. In terms of, and maybe just to highlight the priority identified here, to apply triple bottom line approaches which incorporate social, environmental concerns and economic decision making. We feel that there's generally a high dependency on natural gas in order to drive and sustain our economy. And coupled with this, a limited understanding of, you know, how the economic value of Trinidad and Tobago's natural resources and ecosystem services can really help contribute to climate resilience. And so recommendation was to increase education and awareness on the green economy and green economic approaches, and formalize the use of decision support tools such as natural capital accounting to support economic decision making and approaches that could help feed into the National Development Strategy, Vision 2030. And again, just a reminder that you can read all of the examples that we give in terms of achievements, also what, you know, government and civil society has been doing, all of the gaps and specific recommendations in each of these areas in the report. And so I am just highlighting a few. In terms of climate change and biodiversity, there has definitely been quite a lot of action in terms of, you know, increasing public awareness of climate change. What is climate change? What are actions that can be taken? And you see this in work by the Environmental Management Authority, by others such as the IMA, in key projects that are addressing forestry, such as the Improving Forest and Protected Area Management in Trinidad and Tobago project, which is being implemented by the FAO and the ministry as well in Trinidad and Tobago. And so there is action that has been taken. However, we think that definitely there's a need to support development of a long-term environmental manifesto by civil society. And the reasoning behind this is that we think that right now actions are really tied to this 4 or 5 year, political sort of cycle. And we need to ensure that actions that are being taken are independent of that and can be consistent and effective. And of course, I highlighted already in terms of improving the functionality of the Green Fund to support action, including civil society action on climate change. And those are 2 key areas that CSOs who were assessing this particular area really wanted to highlight. So the last area, climate change, health, water, and food security. I think these priorities really emphasize the need for multi-sectoral working and for climate-smart agriculture and improved water management to minimize climate impacts, as well as looking at research and adequate monitoring of impacts to inform decision making. There has been action that's been taken and examples of work being done in terms of promoting climate smart agriculture. We know that, for example, the Cropper Foundation has been implementing a project that is focused on climate smart agriculture called the MAPS project. And so there are initiatives that have been started that are ongoing, and we recognize that more action needs to be taken. In terms of the research and monitoring on climate change impacts on food, health, and air quality is really about getting a greater sense of how climate change is impacting health through its impact on food, water, and air quality, which we feel is an area we do not have enough information on. So just to give a sense of the key and some of the overarching recommendations across all of the areas that are noted in the report and that we would like to promote, is that we definitely need to update the climate change policy and to mainstream climate change in all of sectoral policies and plans. There are several policies and plans, such as the IWRM, Integrated Water Resources Management Policy, which has clear climate change priorities and objectives, but several other policies and plans are outdated and need to be updated to mainstream climate change considerations, or some of them are current and still need to look at ways in which we can look at integrated action on climate change. Also need to review and update the National Development Monitoring Framework to properly track progress on SDG 13. Essentially, the Vision 2030 identifies priorities for climate action, but it does not identify cross-cutting priorities in terms of climate change and gender, climate change and biodiversity, health, sustainable cities. And so we need to look at the various areas of the monitoring framework for the Vision 2030 strategy and think about how we'll be able to monitor and assess progress that's being made on climate change in a cross-cutting and integrated manner. Other recommendations have to do with making sure that we strengthen and develop mechanisms for coordination. So intersectoral coordination, as well as coordination and engagement with civil society. And we definitely want to ensure that there is a recognition of civil society as key partners in implementing climate responses on the ground. This has been mentioned a few times, but the recommendations to ensure that climate change and disaster responses target the most vulnerable and disempowered. And we know that vulnerable groups and the poor are disproportionately affected by climate and disasters. So this is definitely an area that we need to look at. Also touched on this briefly, but to increase focus on climate change adaptation and building local adaptive capacity, which is also related to the previous points, ensure that people, communities are able to adapt and be resilient in the face of a changing climate. Improve functionality, enhance access of CSOs to the Green Fund. I think that one is clear. Where that CSO, the Green Fund is firstly functioning, properly, and that CSOs then have access to financing to be able to implement work on climate. A definite area, as I mentioned, valuing natural resources is to be able to strengthen understanding of the economic impact of climate change. And therefore, how do we address these impacts in terms of businesses and livelihoods? And in order to finally enhance the enabling environment for climate action, sign and ratify the Escazú Agreement. And this is something that we think is extremely important to ensure transparency, access to information, and promotes environmental justice in Trinidad and Tobago. So these points on the screen really is a reflection of the recommendations that we have made. Included in our report is a call to the government for accelerated climate action. And it includes, the call to consider the priorities, the 30 priorities and actions identified by civil society to address climate change in Trinidad and Tobago. And so we really want to encourage the government and wider society in Trinidad and Tobago to take note that climate action is definitely a priority. It's a priority for us as a small island developing state. And we know that we have seen a number of impacts and implications for various of our sectors. Okay, so this brings me to the end of my presentation, and as Nicole would have mentioned, we do have a session where we can take your comments, reactions, and questions. And so if you could keep your questions, comments, and so on in mind for when we get to that session. But what I would like to do now is to hand you over to Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh, who is the head of the Multilateral Environmental Agreements Unit at the Ministry of Planning and Development, to share remarks with us, as well as his reaction to the report. Please go ahead.
Okay, good morning, and thank you, Candice and CANARI. First of all, let me apologize for the rain. It's pouring here, so if you hear background noise, it's the rain. And as well, I was going to apologize before because I have a lot of birds, and you would have heard a lot of birds singing, but it's now the rain. So if you can't hear me, maybe you can just intervene. I'll try to speak a little bit louder to cover the background noise. So with that said, then let me thank CANARI for the opportunity to provide some views on the report, and as well to make some comments. First off, let me just say that we from our perspective, we welcome the report. I have not had a chance, admittedly, to look in any detail at all of the contents, but Candice's presentation provided much needed background for my own better understanding, and I have looked at the executive summary as well as some of the key recommendations and the call for action that has been detailed in the report. So I think overall the document is very useful. The recommendations, I think, are spot on in keeping with what is now emerging to be recognized globally as a climate emergency, and not long-term climate change anymore, because we have now seen scientific reports coming out stating that the rate of climate change is now unprecedented. The extent to which greenhouse gases are being emitted and the concentrations are now higher than before, and therefore it is now morphing and acknowledging to be a climate emergency. And therefore it is necessary for an all-inclusive approach to addressing the issue, particularly in small and developing states like Trinidad and Tobago that faces an existential threat from the adverse impacts of climate change and in addressing the climate emergency. So it really requires all hands on deck. It's not a situation of where government alone can do it, or the private sector alone can do it, or civil society alone can do it. Everyone needs to hold hands in a coherent way and work to one common objectives. But I would just like to, because of the limited time I have to talk, and I could talk on this for weeks, but to focus basically on the recommendations and the priorities. And let me commend CANARI or the CSO of the project for already going into detail and identifying 30 priorities. And I think that they are spot on in terms of what has been recommended. The ratings might be different from what I think that they should be, but I will go into that a little bit briefly. But I think they align perfectly with the provisions of the latest legal instrument, international legal instrument, the Paris Agreement. Climate change is an evolving issue, and the science is being understood more and more clearly. The uncertainties are being unraveled to a much more comprehensive extent. And to that extent, to that end, the Paris Agreement identifies some of the issues that have already been identified in the report in terms of what is required under this new dispensation to address climate change, such as gender equity, which I think was highlighted in many of the recommendations, the role of non-state actors and the private sector in the Paris Agreement, the need for enhanced transparency and reporting, because now every country needs to report on their emissions and will be cross-examined, for want of a better word, internationally, will be peer-reviewed, and will have to give account of their emissions and the commitments that they have communicated to the UN under the nationally determined contributions. So enhanced transparency is a requirement now. The Paris Agreement also identifies the vulnerable groups, I think much aligned with what has been stated in the report, including issues related to human rights, right to health, rights of indigenous people, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disability, people in vulnerable situations, gender equality, as I said, empowerment of women, intergenerational equity. All of these are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals as we know them. So I think the report is spot on in identifying all of this. But more than that, the Paris Agreement alludes to maybe a few things that pops out. And one is the eradication of poverty as an objective, and the issue of climate justice as a small and developing state that is dependent heavily on oil and gas. Transitioning to cleaner sources of energy and to more sustainable energy has been recognized as a challenge, and therefore issues related to the just transition of the workforce, for example, is now occupying our attention as we start to transition towards more sustainable forms of energy. In that respect, let me then focus on a few, or maybe just give us background what we are doing, and the role being played by civil society. Incidentally, for as long as I can remember, because I chaired the National Climate Change Committee more than 20 years ago, and as far as I can remember, every time we have developed projects or programs to address climate change, we have always had a representative of the civil society organizations and the NGOs on the steering committee to provide insights, to get feedback on views and so on. So we already have an institutional structure that provides the NGOs and the CSOs with a voice to already influence decision making on policy, and as well in determining the directions in which some programs and some projects need to go in order to take their concerns on board. But just to highlight a few of those, which I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, would know, we are participating in several projects supported by the EU and UNDP through GEF funding that aims to do several things in terms of enhancing the institutional and legal capacity in the country to address climate change, and particularly in looking at transparency related to reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. So we have already developed a monitoring, reporting and verification system, and we have tested that. It's housed at the Environmental Management Authority. We have tested that. We have had the participation of the private sector who have tested the functionality of it. We've just gotten the pilot report, and we're tweaking that to make sure that going forward, everything is functional, fully functional. And to that end, we are in the process of developing a certification program where private sector emitting entities can become certified in reporting greenhouse gas emissions. And we're also looking at improving that MRV system to align itself with the Paris Agreement in enhancing the transparency in reporting. I note from Candace's little talk there that introduction to the report that there are a few things that were highlighted. So we are addressing issues related to agriculture, forestry and land use and the waste sector outside of the NDC, developing business as usual baselines and identifying mitigation options that can reduce emissions and build climate resiliency. And one of them is, of course, vertical farming, I think was identified. We are partnering with the FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, through a GCF project to look at the food security. We have already started to look at building climate resilience in rural areas. So we have, with the help of the EU, started to upgrade the Toko Health Center to enhance its climate resilience by retrofitting with solar power, clean water, and so on, so that in the case of an extreme event, as we experienced a few years ago, and it gets cut off from the rest of in roads or anything, that the health center could at least maintain a minimal level of functionality to serve the community. You alluded to the National Climate Change Committee, policy. We are in fact upgrading that, updating it to include the provisions of the Paris Agreement and the decisions coming out. It was delayed, and it was purposely delayed because we wanted to incorporate the provisions of the climate change of the Paris Agreement one, but more so the decisions coming out of the negotiations at the conferences, climate conferences, on how the Paris Agreement is to be implemented, to include aspects of those decisions in the policy and to address issues that have been flagged as important in the Paris Agreement and as well by civil society, such as gender issues, vulnerable groups, and so on. In terms of gender, we have just started looking at the role of gender and analyzing the data. As you would imagine, there's a paucity of data related to gender, and it has been identified as a gap, and which we now acknowledge, and we'll be working with other entities to begin to work out on how to fill those gaps. And because we have identified that the climate change really is a cross-cutting issue, correctly identified by the report as well. And as well, the need to integrate it into national development and national development planning. In fact, that is one of the themes of the updated national climate change policy. We hope that that climate change policy will be finalized. The COVID situation gave us a little bit of a delay, but we hope that that will be finalized soon. We have some more consultations with youth and indigenous peoples and other stakeholders to be conducted before we get their views and integrating it into the policy. But I'm glad also that the report identifies the emergency of climate change. I made a comment at a recent book launch on the climate Oxford Climate Policies Guide to the Paris Agreement, and I can share that link with you all. to disseminate Candace. It's a useful guide at a layman's level so you could understand the provisions of the Paris Agreement. That we can quarantine from a virus, you can quarantine from COVID-19, but we cannot quarantine from climate change. It is going to get us, every sector is going to be affected. There are emerging issues that are now have to be taken into consideration. So issues related to food security is not only about growing your own food and assessing the impacts on your agricultural system, but also on the impacts of systems abroad on which we depend for our own food security by virtue of importing food. So we are now looking at issues related to transboundary impacts of climate change and how it would affect food security based on what we import. In switching to energy, you would have heard the Prime Minister some time ago comment on the fact that the government has now awarded a contract to BP and Shell to construct a 10% a facility that will augment the existing power generation profiling by 10% of renewable energy. So that is also underway. In terms of looking at some of the pointed recommendations that were highlighted in the document, and let me just pull it up here because I wrote it down. Yeah, okay. So in terms of the issues related to financing, we are also undergoing the development of a financial investment plan for NDC implementation for our current NDC that seeks to identify sources of funding, avenues by which funding can be made available to enhance that to implement the NDC. As you know, our NDC has been estimated to cost $2 billion US, and that price tag is reflective of the level of ambition of Trinidad and Tobago's NDC. If you analyze it and compare it to the rest of the region, we have perhaps the most ambitious commitment under the Paris Agreement to reducing our emissions, and we hope that ambition will be enhanced once we get the results of the assessment of the business as usual for the other emitting sectors. So let me just now quickly, because I know time is running out, but I can speak to this, like I say, for weeks, but I won't, of course. We are also rolling out the vulnerability capacity assessment that we conducted a few years ago to the local government bodies and trying to integrate it into their work plans. We have engaged with them before, and they were part of the working groups that actually developed that assessment. Integrating climate change both from a mitigation and adaptation and building climate resilience perspective is something that we have recognized and we are pursuing. Maybe it's not happening fast enough, but we still have to get away from a sort of institutional mindset of keeping our own remits close to us. So we're now trying to incorporate climate change issues into the remits of all of the other entities so that it can be taken into consideration when strategies and policies and plans are being developed sectorally. So I want to maybe just end by saying that the level of participation of civil society has been good from our view. They sit on all our steering committees. We provide them the opportunity, or they provide us with the opportunity of consulting with them and through them to incorporate their views, but we also think that this can be strengthened. We are currently completing a project of enhancing a capacity for implementing MEAs broadly. And part of that has been through consultations with CSOs and NGOs in particular. A separate component was designed specifically for that. And once the recommendations come in and the reports are finalized, we will certainly be adding to that in the context of rolling out a plan by which we can strengthen the participation of CSOs and NGOs to develop a working agenda for climate change action in Trinidad and Tobago that will be underlined by the broad theme now under the UN of no one being left behind. But government alone, as I said, cannot do it alone. We need the support of CSOs, NGOs. They are an equal partner in developing programs and addressing climate change, because they would perhaps be most affected. They are among the most vulnerable groups. But in that respect, I think CSOs and NGOs also have a responsibility to build their own capacity, to build their own advocacy in a way that that can be heard, to build champions among them, to make sure that their voices are heard everywhere, so that the voice from the bottom and from the top can be heard in a synchronized chorus and not a cacophony of noise that will confuse the policymakers. So I would end by just summarizing and saying that congratulate the report. I think the 30 recommendations or so actions are spot on. It's in line with what we are doing, and we look forward to engaging with CSOs as we begin to roll out some of their recommendations, which we will take on board, of course, because it is in alignment with what we're already doing to strengthen that partnership as we address climate change in Trinidad and Tobago. I think I've spoken more than my fair share, and I will say thank you with that.
Thank you so much, Kishan, and that's very encouraging to hear the synergy between civil society priorities developed by the 53 CSOs and really what government is doing. And I certainly took a lot of notes on the government initiatives. We heard from Mark, many initiatives taking place at the UN. Candice also highlighted that we tried to capture some of those initiatives, including by civil society, in the report. So I'm getting a real sense that you know, there's coherence and agreement on what the priorities are, and actually a willingness to come together and have that whole of society approach to see what role can we all play to have stronger climate action in Trinidad and Tobago. So I think really interesting from the speakers. And we do have a bunch of questions coming in, and I know Mark has limited time. So Mark, I know you did respond to Gia already, but we had a specific question from Gia on more information on the solar panel work being done in communities, which Kishan also spoke a bit about what's being done in Toco. So Gia, I hope your question was answered well. You did say thank you, Mark. So, and Kishan also spoke about it.
Yeah, can I quickly add?
Yes, please.
For those of you who watched the news last night, one of the news stations highlighted a story that spoke to a family in a rural area that had no electricity for years, for more than a decade, and have young children who are studying for exams and so on. And private sector came in to help, and they installed a fully functional renewable energy system that meets the minimum power requirements for the family. So they can now watch TV and, you know, use a fan, use lights, and so on and so forth. So the point I'm making is that that has already been demonstrated amply, that the renewable energy can work. It is the way of the future, and we can't get away from it. It's the transitioning to that place that we want to be that will pose the challenges, because I don't think we are transitioning fast enough. That's my own personal view. It's not a ministry's view. But the point is that these rural off-grid power generation systems by renewable energy can work. They are working, and that is one of the objectives of the project that Mark spoke to, that is now underway through the UNDP with EU funding to broaden that. So it's already being demonstrated, just to add that.
Great. And I think, yeah, there's proof of concept. These things are being tested in the countries in small scale. And I think we do have a follow-up question on local government and the role of disaster management agency and the ODPM. And I think the challenge is, how do we scale this up? How do we really roll out these efforts to achieve scale in making a difference in the communities, as Candice said, where the impacts are being felt and where vulnerable people are? And Kishan, you said that the vulnerability capacity assessment is going to be rolled out to local government. So I wanted to invite you, tell us more about what's the vision of how local government and community level action can really take place. And then Candice, I'll turn over to you. In your previous life, you were with the ODPM and give a perspective on disaster management and resilience building at the community level as well.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. The VCA report, which I will send you a link, or ask Cindy to send you a link, which you can disseminate to all, that identifies the vulnerable areas when we did the vulnerability and capacity assessment, and the issues that need to be attended to in terms of flooding, coastal inundation, things like that. But most of them are in localized areas. So the idea now is to, because the local government participants were on the technical working groups that actually developed the project. So we already have them, you know, they are aware and they understand. The next step, of course, is to now see how we can integrate the results of that report, of those recommendations, into the functioning and the strategies and the operational aspects of the local government. So that's a conversation. That's the next step in the conversation that we're going to have. But as you would imagine by now, we have a lot of things going on, and finding the time and the space sometimes could prove challenging. But that is certainly the next step, to look at climate extremes, how they can mitigate it, how they can, in their own local government programming and development, cater for climate extremes, because the models show that we're going to have less rainfall in the future, but you're going to have more intense rainfall, which means more flooding. So when you design your drainage, for example, you design it to accommodate that flooding. And let me just say that we are also now in conversation with some community groups to look at a program for adaptation funding to look at flood alleviation in those areas. And one of those areas that was identified in the VCA. So we're now looking for funding under the adaptation fund to develop a project that will define concrete implementation plans and interventions that will alleviate the flooding. So the work is going on. Perhaps we're perhaps guilty of not sharing more with all, but that is certainly something I take in terms of the transparency issue, and I will address it immediately. Get my team together to put out something that is comprehensive as a follow-up to this, so that all can be assuaged. And of course, we will welcome feedback if you know, for more recommendations if they're not in depth. But you know, it takes time to do these things, to develop the programs and to roll them out. But we're doing equal amounts on both the mitigation side, the adaptation side, and building climate resilience into the national development programming.
Thanks, Kishan. And I know the idea of mapping risk around the country at the local community is not new, and the ODPM has done it years ago. Candice, you want to give us a sense of how the disaster and resilience to disasters comes in here? Candice, don't forget to unmute. You and Kishan can stay unmuted, I think.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. Yes, and I was beginning to say, I think it's two things that in terms of disaster and building resilience, I think there's a need for more community voices, which I already highlighted as part of the report, but also the need for more practical action on the ground that engages communities. And I definitely think that with the system where the ODPM is coordinating and the disaster management units at the municipal level, for example, is on the ground in the different municipalities, you know, there is opportunity for the disaster management units to help make that connection to communities on the ground. And the other point, I think, is that we have to continue to treat disasters and building resilience to disasters and climate change in this kind of cross-cutting manner. Because when people in communities on the ground, their livelihoods are being impacted, they are impoverished, how do we get them to respond in the way that we need them to when we feel the impacts from a changing climate or a disaster? So those are the kind of perspectives, and I think the work is ongoing at the disaster office. I'm sure, you know, but I think a more focused effort linking climate change and disasters and making sure community voices are heard, and that there is concerted effort for practical actions that engage communities on the ground.
Yeah, and I think we had great discussion at our workshop from civil society organizations. You know, these are the folks who are on the ground in the communities, embedded there, trying to address these actions. And I remember the agricultural society working with farmers and so on. I want to invite participants, if anybody would like to be part of the conversation, you can not only type your questions, comments there, you can raise your hand and I'll be able to open up your mic if you'd like to comment, because I think what we're hearing is that there are initiatives, there's need for more coordination, there's need to scale up, but at the first stage is knowing what we're each doing and what capacity we each bring into the table, you know, as Kishan said. So I think very much getting awareness of what's happening out there, and therefore what roles we can all play is really important. So that invitation is out there, and Sasha will help me see if someone has raised their hand and I don't know. And we also are streaming live on Facebook, so she's keeping an eye on that. But I think I want to then go to Kishan and ask maybe a big question. You know, we're getting a lot of positive response from the work by civil society organizations, really sharing what they see as priorities and putting themselves out there and saying, this is where we are, these are some gaps which mean opportunities for work together. You know, do you see this type of report from civil society being something that can catalyze, strengthen partnerships with governments, with private sector, with some of the development partners in the UN? You know, Kishan, how do you see this report helping to move us forward in a whole of society approach?
Well, like I said before, Nicole, the report, from what I've seen and what I've heard, to me succinctly captures the issues that need to be addressed for climate action in Trinidad and Tobago, both from a regional, international perspective, as well as what needs to be done on the ground. But I think the value in the report really is getting that perspective from those that really matter, in a sense. The vulnerable groups, the people in the community groups, those are on the ground, the sort of the canaries, if you want, who will have the first line of defense or vulnerability. It's good to get that perspective. So I think, I know we don't know all, I don't know all, we consult, but and we use the guidelines as much as we can. But every situation and every circumstance, every society is different. Every community is different. So I think the real value of this report is really identification of those issues that can now give us a better or broader view of where the actions need to be perhaps focused on or redirected or enhanced without compromising the overall holistic approach. So I think that really where the value of the report lies. And certainly, yes, to answer your question, yes, it does provide a platform on which we can have this enhanced conversation, because we've been having this through the MEA Focal Point Network, admittedly not working as it was designed to, but that is because of capacity issues in-house, because it takes a lot of management to do that. But once the recommendations that are coming out of the MEA capacity building project are concluded, then we can use that in tandem with your report to develop an action plan or rollout for enhancing that MEA, because it came out loud and clear during the consultations that while it's a good initiative, it needs to be wrapped up, and that is a point that is well taken.
Good. And I think following up on that, you know, getting consensus on priorities and amplifying voice and so on is one thing, but there's one question, are there good examples of partnerships with CSOs in place that can act as models for development of new ones? And I think the question is really moving towards partnerships for action, for implementation. So, you know, and really remembering participants, you can contribute here. We have two responses from Colleen. of partnerships among CSOs. This very collaboration, I would say, was extremely unique for all of us. Never before in my experience, and I have the gray hair of experience in civil society in Trinidad and Tobago, had we worked across all sectors like this. And I think it was a very rich experience. And so this is a model of how civil society can better work together, having that 360 view across the SDGs and learn from each other. But I think, you know, also looking, you know, Kishan, do you think there are any models where governments can work with civil society towards climate action and civil society can play an implementing role?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that question will be best answered by civil society, because I don't want to speak for them and say, well, this is a good example or that is a good example, and well, it's not a good example. So it would be interesting to hear the views of NGOs and civil society from that perspective, in terms of whether they see any projects or partnerships that really add value to their concerns. Because I wouldn't want to handpick any project for obvious reasons. But more so, not to prejudice the views of by saying it's good or bad, when it might not be so in the view or perceptions of those involved. So I would depend on CSOs to do that. But there are two other questions, one by Bertrand and somebody called Sigoni M.
Let me just, yes, let me let Candice respond to that, because Candice really was the lead author pulling together the many wonderful ideas and submissions by the 53 CSOs. Candice, did you, you know, in your reading and sharing, and you were CANARI's lead on this civil society for good governance project funded by the EU for 3 years, where we really heard a lot of sharing from civil society organizations on what's working. You know, did anything strike you that you'd like to put out there as a possible model?
I mean, I think you said it, Nicole. We hadn't worked together in this way before across sectors and so on. And so if I can use the CSOs for the governance project and the SDGs Catalysts Network as an example, you know, the real learning was first opening up to each other and understanding what we each were about. And I think not just within civil society, that is what is needed across sectors now. And that opening up, understanding, you know, what the focus was for each CSO that was participating as part of the network, gave us insight or more insight into what are opportunities to collaborate, what are key areas where we can and should be advocating. So I think it's just putting us in a space where we are open to partnerships and collaboration is what I would highlight out of this. And in terms of translating or transferring that to the development of the report, we really saw where the Catalyst Network and CANARI as part of the Catalyst Network were able to engage our extended networks then to input and be part of a process. And so it makes whatever we do, you know, more comprehensive and more credible. And definitely there could be more work done in terms of now collaborating and engaging with government. But I think it is a good start.
And Kishan, what we realized then is that by mobilizing across civil society, people working in all sectors, you know, with disabilities, on health and so on, those civil society organizations become champions with government agencies in their sector. You know, so, you know, we really saw a lot of value in this cross-sectoral approach in a meaningful way, really trying to understand what the implications were. And hopefully then there can be this bottom-up push support. I like how you said, Kishan, a synchronized chorus of voices from the bottom and the top, you know. And so I think in civil society, people are really putting themselves out there ready to do that. Kishan, let me turn over. There are 2 questions you'd like to answer on energy and this $2 billion investment in mitigation. Please.
Okay, so thank you for the question. Yes, the NDC implementation, the NDC itself, if you look at it and you Google it, you can see it. The estimate cost, or the estimated cost of implementation is $2 billion at that time, because of what we thought, based on our projections, was something that is doable both in terms of cost effectiveness, reducing emissions and technology interventions and so on. The NDC does in fact say that the source of funding will come from a mixture of international and domestic sources. I don't know if 100% can be sought from the Green Climate Fund. Getting $2 billion from the Green Climate Fund will be in itself ambitious, I would imagine. But we have already started to look at and achieve aspects of the NDC. So for example, the state-funded fuel switching program from the CNG, that CNGC program, is already realizing emissions as one of the commitments we made, a unilateral commitment that is not conditional to international support. And that is continuing to expand. And hopefully the conversation will be taken to the next step, because we also recognize that CNG is a transitionary fuel. It's clean, it's the cleanest fossil fuel, but it's still a fossil fuel. And where we want to get to is a situation of sustainable transport. So we are also looking at exploring ideas about developing an e-mobility framework and policy to be charged with renewable energy towards absolute emissions free. So part of the funding will also be, or where we can access funding, will also be identified in the financial investment plan that I alluded to, that is being developed, so that we can see where the sources of funding can be had, both locally, domestically, through raising financing instruments, through loans, concessionary loans, bonds and so on, debt swaps and so on. So those are the things that that report will look at, that analysis will look at. So that basically is a kind of an overview on where that money is going to be sourced. So it's a mixture of international and local funding.
Excellent, thank you. And yeah, so certainly not funded 100% from the Green Fund, from the Green Climate Fund, sorry. Multiple sources, thank you.
What a distinction.
Yeah, easy to make mistakes. Omar Mohammed from the Cropper Foundation has an interesting question there. I think in terms of looking at putting climate at the center of the COVID-19 recovery pathway, I know the Trinidad and Tobago government is where the Prime Minister has a final draft of the roadmap on his desk, and we're waiting with bated breath for that to be released, and we can have discussion. Omar, I've opened up your mic. I think you are muted. I don't know if you want to make a broader comment before we open it up to others.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, this has been said, I think, by a number of civil society groups since we've started talking about this post-COVID discussion, is the understanding that we have very short-term responsibilities, but even in discussions around long-term and medium-term, there has not been a lot of mention of environment. And even though that is a pillar of the Vision 2030, sorry, it hasn't showed up. And even in the the draft roadmap that has been sort of sent around recently, it still doesn't play a major role. And seeing that a lot of emphasis is being placed on revitalizing the energy sector as a major post-COVID pillar, where do we stand in terms of wanting to be Paris compliant, but also hinging on things like construction and energy as our major drivers. So I think it's important to understand, have we been having these discussions about how we become Paris compliant in the other sectors that we've been trying to focus on? and have those conversations been happening that we may not know about, and what are the opportunities for us to play a part in those conversations?
So Kishan, over to you as kind of the lead technical person in the government on climate change. Do you think this is being considered in the recovery agenda?
Sorry, I have not seen the plan in its totality, so I don't want to second guess it. But let me just answer it in a more broad way. And maybe this could also answer Sigoni's question as well, because I think they really
please.
What the COVID-19 pandemic did was to provide the world with a real life lab experiment of how the world can go on without environmental damage or excessive environmental damage. And we've seen reports where emissions have come down because and so on. We've also seen elsewhere where the IEA, for example, the International Energy Agency, has reported that emissions can be decoupled from economic growth. Before that, there was a school of thought that says, no, economic growth will have emissions, concomitant emissions with it. So with that kind of demonstrated proof, I think, as Winston Churchill said, we should not let a good crisis go to waste. So there are valuable lessons to be learned in the COVID-19 crisis. And if there's the will, certainly with the falling cost of renewable energy, for example, and technology, and the realization that that is where we're going. I think here is now an opportunity where the COVID experience, coupled with the demonstrated proof of decoupling emissions from economic growth, as well as the decreasing cost of RE and sustainable energy, can all be married together to form a really sustainable path forward. So I think there are valuable lessons in the COVID-19 experience. But what I think, and this is a personal expression, is that any recovery should not be a quick fix. So you don't dig a hole to fill a hole. So I think moving forward, it provides that opportunity, and that experience provides the opportunity to really develop green growth going forward, because the world has survived. The world will survive COVID-19, but it can't quarantine from climate change. And if we don't recognize that now, we'll just be making things worse. And that awareness, I think, needs to be spread across the world, across governments. I think it's being recognized as well.
Yeah, and I heard a great quotation from a bunch of leading economists, Stern and so on, analyzing COVID-19 and the climate implications. And they said, we don't want to jump out of the COVID-19 frying pan into the climate change fire. And the other crisis and risk being brought in is a risk of biodiversity collapse and collapse in ecosystem services. And one thing that CANARI has been working on in this area is promoting nature-based solutions and really building up our natural ecosystems, which can help build our resilience, facilitate adaptation and mitigation. So to what extent do you think, the government's priorities so far have very much focused on mitigation? Do you think actually the potential of natural resources and investing in ecosystems could actually be strengthened because of this crisis, Kishan?
No, absolutely. I think what has been highlighted, one of the things that has been highlighted out of this, if you look at the news, you see where natural ecosystems have been brought back to life, if you want, where things have allowed to purge itself and really maximize its ecosystem services. One of the challenges that we face as a small and developing state is that the need for land space in a limited environment, for development, for housing, for highways, for roads, and so on. in order to realize economic growth for its citizens and affluence for its citizens and a decent quality of life. And that's a challenge that has always been there. And arising out of that challenge is where we find it difficult to distill the climate change signal from the development signal. And one way that can be sort of second guessed, if you want, or prevented on a precautionary basis, is by actually incorporating climate risk impact assessment into development projects and looking at the value of ecosystem services, for example. Because to replace 1 kilometer of mangrove with a seawall, I mean, the seawall serves only one purpose, but the mangrove would serve multiple purposes for building climate resilience. So one way of doing it, and I think the EMA already has that wit to do that through the CEC process by incorporating climate impact and climate risk impact assessment into its CEC process. I think the development the national development planning can really realize and be truly integrated in a way that will take into consideration these climate risks. So ecosystem services, the value of ecosystem services are well documented. And we see that, we'll see more of that coming in the next few years, maybe beyond our generation, and as I'm saying, where forests, for example, to trap water and to recharge aquifers, when we will be seeing reduced rainfall in the coming years, and therefore limited potability. And that will have knock-on effects for sanitation and public health and so on. The value of ecosystem services will, I think, become more and more pronounced. It's already there, but again, the challenge is balancing the need for development in a smaller space. Not that it cannot be done, but we just have to find a way of maximizing the synergy, minimizing the impact, and I think incorporating climate change impact assessment into the CEC process is one way that can be done.
And we look forward to that happening. And Bertrand Bikari from Environment Tobago, commenting in this area, says, the nature services really needs to be at the center of the recovery. And in particular, he's suggesting natural capital accounting and bringing the value of nature into our economic decision making as well. Not just development control through the CEC as well, but really how can we really appreciate the value of natural capital, social capital, physical capital, and financial is a big challenge. And I know Crocker Foundation had done work on this for years, and really I don't think we got anywhere.
It's not a new area. I mean, environmental accounting has been around for 40 years, I think. It started in the early 70s. It's now, once we get into a system of national accounting for all assets, so that we truly understand the worth of the capital base, not only because we do that for oil and gas in any event. If we find a oil reserve or gas reserve, we can easily estimate its value by monetizing it. The same should be done or could be done with a mangrove system or forest or specific ecosystem. So I think that's where we would want to certainly get to in getting getting a sense of the economic value of the national capital base in all its aspects, rather than those that can be easily monetized. I think that is where the climate change tagline will have its most potent impact.
Yeah.
Because the resiliency building is directly related to it.
Yeah, and building all of those capitals. I read a very interesting report on inclusive wealth recently, and Trinidad and Tobago was highlighted that the concept of inclusive wealth is including natural, social, and physical. And in general, the trend globally, 150 or so countries they looked at, over the past 25 years, natural capital is declining and being replaced by physical capital. The love of concrete that we have in this country, and not necessarily building social capital either. And Trinidad and Tobago, overall, inclusive wealth was actually declining. So really, question Sandra Pike, Anthony of Vineyapon talked about this long-term vision for sustainable development, and really appreciating these different forms of capital is critical, and what role can civil society play, in a non-partisan way to take this longer-term sustainable development vision forward through whatever government, is there. And I know strong technocrats like you in the ministry, Kishan. We have Ian Wallace who would like to talk. Ian, I don't know what you want to talk about, but I'm going to open you up. So please unmute.
Right. Hello. Hi. Good morning.
Good morning.
The question I have is recently we spoke to the Institute of Marine Affairs, and they had said that the waters around Trinidad and Tobago had become the cleanest in several decades during the COVID-19 shutdown and lockdown around Trinidad and Tobago. They had concerns that even though they have seen these gains, there are plans as they reopen the economy as to keep these gains that we've seen. So is civil society such as the Fish Book, etc., contacting you, and are they looking to see how they can manage to keep these waters as clean as they are, given that it could also have been linked to shutdowns in industries, etc.? So I'm not sure who that question goes to, but that's the comment that they had.
Let me ask, let me give Kishan a small break and ask Candice if you had any reaction. Candice in CANARI, in her work in CANARI, does a lot of work at the local community level with resource users and local communities, including coastal communities. Candice, what's your sense of how coastal communities and resource users would want to move forward in this? Do you have any thoughts?
Nicole, you might have to just summarize the question for me. I have a bit of noise.
Yeah, so I think Ian's really looking at, the waters now in the COVID lockdown are clean or cleaner than they've been in a long time, according to the IMA. And he's suggesting it might be because of the shutdown in industries and so on. But, I think how would fisherfolk, local communities be wanting to see this move forward? In any sense from you, have you been hearing anything from them?
I mean, I think that there is a general awareness that things have changed, that the quality of, the resources in the communities have changed. And of course, linked to that is the fact that people have not been moving out and about as normal. And the reactions, or initial reactions that we've gotten is that that's great. But as of now, I don't think we know how much of that is going to continue. But at least it is a sitting example of what is possible. And a realization from people on the ground that they have a part to play in managing our resources, in contributing to good environmental management in our country. As I used to say that when I was at the disaster office, that we haven't had the historical experience, for example, of having a hurricane as some of the other islands, and so we do not respond or react in the way that they do. And so maybe having experiences like this, and I think Kishan sort of, spoke about this, we shouldn't let this go to waste. And it's an opportunity to use it and promote the example of what could be possible if we continue to manage our environment and each take personal responsibility in our communities.
So people are seeing a potential future or state of being that they think is actually a positive. Kishan, you have a comment on this as well?
No, but I think what the IMA report highlights is how potent our footprint can be in terms of environmental degradation. So I think putting the management systems in place can actually be effective. And again, issues related to water pollution permits, the rules and enforcement. It's not for a lack of laws at all or regulations, but our society is a bit well, it's not a bit unique, it's I think it's typical, but I think we need more carrots sometimes than stick, or more stick more than carrots, but it also requires behavioral change. at the bottom up. And I think this is an opportunity for CSOs to actually build that sort of champions that you alluded to before at the ground level, to take responsibility for their own environment, and not wait for government to say, well, we pass a law that you can't do this, or you should not do that. Of course, that is required. You need more sticks sometimes, but there is enough stick. But building champions, building the environmental champions at the community level, I think is critical. And this is an opportunity where I think CSOs need it. I said this earlier, not only in the context of climate change, but broad environmental issues, because everything is interconnected under climate change, as you report adequately points out. I think building champions, I think, is a challenge for you, Nicole, and for all the CSOs who are listening, to actually take responsibility for their own environment and stop polluting, to employ best environmental management practices. And I think if we take that responsibility and champion it, we can hold that line. That, like I said, COVID-19 provided a real-life laboratory for us to experiment, and we actually see the results. We now have a responsibility to implement that, and I think that's where CSOs have a tremendous responsibility to ensure that that we can hold that line.
Yeah. And this also one second of the value or the potential for using our, oh gosh, what do you call it, the environmental court, the environmental commission more. And I know that they have been doing outreach to civil society and communities, trying to encourage them to use those mechanisms to flag concerns and so on. As you said, we have a strong legal framework, but perhaps we're not using it as much as we can. Ian, if you could hold 1 second, let me just get another voice in here. I see Akila Jaramogi from Fonzaman's Community Reforestation Project, which is a strong community champion for many decades. Akila, I have you unmuted, so you just unmute yourself. Please go ahead.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, Akila, we're hearing you.
Hi, yes, I want to say thanks to this excellent report, and the way you captured, the civil society organizations who have been doing work and continue to do work. And for Keishan, you have an excellent tool to work with now. Well, not now, but an excellent updated package. And not just for you alone, but I know for many other agencies and ministries in Trinidad and Tobago. So therefore, this tool will not just be a planning tool package, but a package that can be used across the board. Other environmental stakeholders, state agency stakeholders, let them, be aware of what we are doing, what we continue to do. In spite of all the struggles, we managed to stay there, hang in there, and continue to deliver. Now this is action time. We have been talking climate change. Let's say climate crisis now. Let us try to get the state to, put it as part of the agenda, I know post-COVID action, yes, and little about the environment, but we are also entering the rainy season. We are in the rainy season now, and it's all about, a lot will be based on the environment, the post-fire now, what will be happening and readiness to deal with situations. But all in all, I just want to congratulate the CANARI and all those NGOs and CBOs who have been demonstrating, that sense of leadership and ownership and championing the cause to keep, the environment and the work that they have been doing, to the standard that it is now. But definitely we need help, we need action, not just, to say, yes, this is a good report or, post, whatever, but we need action. And that action means that we need you all to invest in us, find some money and come into the environment, come into the communities and let us start talking, real action. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Akila. And that was a strong sense from the work in preparing the report. It very much wasn't a report saying, hey, government, here's what you have to do. It was very much saying, this is what we have done and this is what we need to do more of together. But the issue of climate finance is very important. So Kishan, I'm remembering you saying the government is working on a financial investment plan. And I do hope that looks at mechanisms to ease civil society's access to funding as well, so we can be more effective. I think that would be an important enabler for real partnerships and action on the ground.
Let me just qualify. Let me just qualify that the financial investment plan is for NDC implementation.
Right.
But certainly any opportunity for CSOs to participate. Of course, one of them is rural electrification, which is also being pursued under the GCC plus UNDP project, and for which there are already financial instruments under the tax break. For example, we just got last year, I think, 100% rebate on solar water heater systems. So I think there are many financial instruments already there that I think the uptake has been poor. I don't know if it's because electricity continues to be cheap, or it has been because of poor socializing the opportunities. But we already have a suite of financial incentives that can be utilized by civil society and communities to actually contribute to more energy efficient consumption and renewable energy. So, but this certainly will be taken into consideration. Yes.
Yeah, and somebody did have a question. I think it got dismissed by mistake about how can people access support for greening business. So I think all of that, there are mechanisms there. I think certainly the MEA project, the analysis of the Green Fund, is ease of access. So sometimes instruments are there, people don't know about it. So how can these be made more accessible? How can there be outreach on what is available and some support provided to enable access, not only for civil society, but also business, I think is a useful point. Ian, I do want to allow you to speak again. I asked you to hold a second. Would you like to do a follow-up? I had seen your hand and now it's down. Okay. I want to go back there. There was a comment from Sandra Pike Anthony about this longer term vision for sustainable development, and a follow-up comment, well, a different comment from Omar Mohammed of Cropper Foundation on a model that he thinks could be used, being the Council for Sustainable Development in Trinidad and Tobago. Omar, would you like to comment on that or anything else? I did see your hand pop up and down, up and down.
Oh, sorry, well, the hand was a mistake, but okay. Those two models, I think, are really examples of this kind of tripartite model, which is what I think we're going for. Well, the National Council for Sustainable Development is, through the National Environmental Policy, and also the Trinidad and Tobago Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative is another tripartite model that is, intimately engaged with climate change because it focuses on energy. And, the thrusts globally with the EITI is looking to see how this EITI framework can help push energy transitions. So the conversations around it, particularly in how we finance the energy sector, is directly related to climate change. And for civil society, we have an equal number of representatives on this committee. And the hope is that by the end of the year, we will be opening up that field wider, because as of today, it was part of a cabinet appointed group from the start in 2011. And we want to actually have a much more representative civil society faction. So, those two models, I think, are ripe for picking. The two of them play a very intimate role in the wider environmental conversation. So I think those two things, should be paid close attention to.
Thank you, Omar. And we only have a few minutes. I want to make sure we get to as many comments and questions as we can. We have a question from Arlene, from Anonymous, about is CANARI ready or willing to transpond this program to a wider area, let's say regionally. So I think I could answer for CANARI, just to say CANARI is really excited to have had this opportunity to work with the 52 other civil society organizations in Trinidad and Tobago, many of whom are on this call and who are listed in the report, who are on the ground doing very powerful work, action and advocacy. And really we played that role trying to bring these voices together for this symphony, this synchronized chorus, as Kishan put it. And we are excited because we see this as a potential model that could be applied to any area, not only climate. How can we all come together and look at gender? How can we all come together and look at poverty? How can we all come together, and look at human well-being across all of the SDGs? So CANARI is, willing and interested, but remember we are a very small player, and it really requires strong civil society organizations in the country and at the regional level to be able to come together. And the support of the European Union and then in the Green Climate Fund in helping us to publish a report, I think was critical. This doesn't happen without significant investment of time and resources by all of the co-authors in the report. So certainly the answer is yes, we're willing, but of course resources are needed and partners are needed on the ground. So feel free to contact CANARI at any time to talk more. Let me quickly turn over. I see a question from Tracy Hutchinson-Wallace from Habitat for Humanity, one of the CSOs very actively involved in the project and development of the report. Of course, their focus on housing and safe, sustainable housing for all. She has a question on how can this really increase housing access. Tracy, let me try and open you up in case you want to comment there. You're open. If you want to unmute and make an additional comment.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, and thanks everyone for coming to this conference. My concern.
Tracy, can you talk a little louder?
Sorry, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Right. My concern with the report really is something that I think some of us have expressed in various areas, including Bertrand Vicari and Ian with the cleanliness of the water situation. Right now, the government, the business sector is really focused on getting things back to whatever was normal before. And as much as Habitat recognizes that there is a need to restart the economy, we know that construction is a serious driver of the economy, and getting construction activity going again is good for us. I don't want this, I want to know how this report can help us hold the line, as I said, and make sure that we don't go back to the old way of doing things where environmental issues become an add-on to the real construction issues. I think Bertrand said, and a couple of others said, that there's going to be a lot of pushback. I just would like to know if we're going to meet at some point to map out a strategy to get all of those, all of our ideas on how to hold the line in a cohesive way so that we are all singing from the same page when we're meeting with other people within our various areas.
Yeah, and Tracy, I think that's a challenge. Kishan had talked earlier about civil society and communities being strong champions. And so what I really take from your comment is how can we in civil society mobilize together again to have a strong voice in this recovery path. And, Gia, thanks for sharing, your very powerful statement. The environment has been crying out, I cannot breathe, but we're not hearing. How can we lift our knees off the neck of the environment? So I think there is a strong concern. Kishan, as a government person on the call, I want you to take note of the interest of civil society in having nature and climate at the heart of the recovery. And we certainly need to go beyond this.
I just wanted to re-emphasize that because my NGO is specifically targeted at doing much more construction, we do kind of need everybody else's help to sing the chorus.
Yeah.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah. And so how can we in our own organizations and our sectors actually change the way we work? And, you know, CANARI as well, let me flip that coin. CANARI is having to think very much how do, in our work, which focuses on the environment, how do we incorporate issues of justice and human rights and gender and disabilities and all of those issues. So I think it takes all of us to really appreciate the importance of this. I want to open up and invite an international voice. We have Beth from IISD. Beth, I did unmute you. I don't know if you wanted to make a comment. So IISD, Candice, do you know if Beth wants to talk? Candice, you're muted.
I'm not sure if Beth is still with us. I think she,
Okay.
she may have to.
Okay, I did unmute her and she disappeared. Okay. So we only have, we have no more time. Yeah, so just, I think in wrapping up then, apologies to anybody whose question I didn't get to or comment, didn't properly address. I think it was a rich discussion. And I really want to thank our speakers, Mark, who's not here, but I think has been a strong supporter, and the UN has been a strong supporter to civil society throughout this. Kishan, the Ministry of Planning and Development, and your personal commitment, we really, really appreciate, and thank you for sharing. And I think there's a lot of best kept secrets in what you shared. And the opportunity is for us to learn more about what the government is doing, to communicate more about what civil society is doing, and find that possibility for partnering and joint action. And we're certainly ready. I've read comments, people are here ready, you know, so how can we move forward from this sort of report? Candice, I want to thank you for your leadership and lead author of this report and leading all of us in this collaborative effort. You know, 53 civil society organizations. This report is your own. By no means we want to you know, minimize that this is really a collective report. But thanks to Candice for your presentation and helping to pull us all together and get all those voices into chorus. I want to thank again the European Union and the Green Climate Fund for their support for strong civil society action here. It's been ongoing, and we look forward to further work with them and with the Ministry of Planning and Development in really taking forward you know, this report. We hope that the government will consider it as a submission for the official voluntary national report, whether the findings are incorporated, whether it's an addendum, you know, really sharing these perspectives from the ground in Trinidad and Tobago. And then how do we move forward together in implementation of the SDGs? Civil society is very serious and kind of ready to work with the government and private sector and other partners. So I think that is it from us. Candice, anything I have forgotten?
No, I think that's it, Nicole.
Okay. So Colleen, I see you have your hand up. Would you like the last word? Briefly, because we're over time. Go ahead.
It wasn't a mistake. It was a mistake, but I just want to say I'm so very proud of CANARI and Candice for taking the lead. And I pray that the momentum that you all have created to be able to show that civil society can actually have a voice at all kinds of levels, we will be able to pick it up and run with it. Congratulations and thanks again for your leadership.
Thanks to us. So Colleen, pat yourself on the back from the Kwan. All the civil society organizations, pat yourself on the back. Kishan, you could pat yourself on the back for your continued leadership of climate action in Trinidad and Tobago. For many people internationally, Kishan is the face of climate action in Trinidad and Tobago and the region and internationally. So thank you, Kishan. And we really look forward to talking to you. And on a small note, thanks to Sasha Harinanan, who's here helping with technical arrangements. And please, let's all use the virtual technology to keep communicating. This launch of this report is really charting a path forward. Okay, so we look forward to continue. Thank you again, Keisha and Candice and Mark especially. And have a great day, everybody, and a low carbon day, please, everybody. How about that? Right, personal action. Take care, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye.